Now we're going to look at rationalizing with if you have a sum or a difference in your denominator. So to rationalize this one, we again want to be able to apply the square root or the cube root or whatever we have. All of these will have square roots though. And our strategy is just a little bit different than it was when we had just a single root, like just the radical 3. What we need to do is to utilize a difference of squares. And you're going to see how the difference of squares plays out when I go ahead and apply the first step. I'm going to multiply by the conjugate of this denominator. The conjugate just changes signs. So we're going to multiply by the conjugate, which changes plus to a minus or minus to a plus. So if I multiply by the conjugate then of this denominator, instead of 2 plus radical 3, I'm going to multiply by 2 minus radical 3. I'll do the same thing in the numerator, 2 minus radical 3. Let's bring this guy down here where we've got some room. In the numerator, it's just the 2 minus radical 3, no problem. In my denominator, I'm going to end up foiling. I'm going to write what I have so you can see exactly what happens. I'm going to go ahead and foil first, outer, inner, last as a way to multiply, and then I'm going to show you a shortcut. So it's really important that you watch how this works. So as I do my first multiplication in the denominator, let me give myself some room down here, and I'm going to write the numerator so we're ready. So that first product, 2 times 2 is 4. First, outer, the outer product is 2 times radical 3, which is going to be negative, so there's my outer. 2 times the negative gives me a negative 2, and then the radical is a radical 3. Inner are these two, so inner is a positive 2 times the radical 3, so that's plus 2 radical 3. And then finally the last product are these two. Can you follow that? It's the radical 3 times the negative radical 3. So that's going to be positive times negative, so negative radical 3 times radical 3. Take a look at these middle terms. When you have that difference of squares, you're going to end up with middle terms that cancel out. And here's the difference of squares. A 4, which was the 2 squared, and then radical 3 times radical 3 is another something times itself. So there's another square. So it's going to be the 4 minus the square of the last term. So whether or not you recognize that, we're going to get ourselves to a rationalized answer. So my numerator, 2 minus radical 3. My denominator is a 4. These two canceled out, and negative and a positive of the same value are 0. And then on the end here we have minus radical 9, 3 times 3. So we get 2 minus radical 3 divided by 4 minus square root of 9 is 3. So that's going to be a 1 in our denominator, which we don't even need. So we can just write our answer as 2 minus radical 3. So we multiply by that conjugate. Let's look at a second example. So for a second example, for the second one, let's do something like, so number 2, I'm going to put a radical in my numerator, and in my denominator, I'm going to do radical 2 minus radical 5. So I'm going to multiply by the conjugate of that denominator, which means I need to multiply by, I don't want their difference, I want their sum. Radical 2 plus radical 5. Same thing in the numerator, radical 2 plus radical 5. So there's that conjugate. Instead of the difference, I multiply by the sum. I'm going to distribute in a minute. Let me first just write out what this looks like as a single fraction. There's the numerator multiplied together, and my denominator multiplied together, so that difference times the sum. Okay, so we have a little bit of work to do here, but we can work our way through it. I'm going to distribute in that numerator. So we're going to multiply the radical 2 times what we have in the numerator. Radical 2 times radical 2, I can multiply the 2's together, and that becomes the square root of 4. I have a plus sign in the middle. Radical 2 times radical 5, they're both square roots, so I can multiply the 2 and the 5 together, so that's going to be a square root of 10. We'll come back and simplify that one. Now in my denominator, remember how those middle terms cancel out? They're going to again, because I have the same radicals, but one's a minus and one's a plus. So I'm not going to do that outer product and the inner product. I know those are going to be, what are they here? Radical 10s, so radical 10 there and a minus radical 10. I'm not going to do those. So instead I'm going to simplify this because I know it's a difference of squares. I'm just going to do the first product, so there's my first product, and the last product, which is right there. It's going to save me a step. So first product is radical 2 times radical 2, which is a radical 4. I'll clean that up in a minute. We already talked about the middle terms canceling out. They're both radical 10s, one positive, one negative. Then the last one is a minus radical 5 times 5, radical 25. Okay, now the only thing I've got left is to clean it up. Square root of 4 is 2 plus radical 10. Okay, my denominator, square root of 4 is 2 minus square root of 25 is 5. So we end up with 2 plus radical 10 divided by negative 3. There's our answer. You can split it up and you can express it in different ways, but that's essentially the answer. Okay, one last example. Make sure I've got room for it. Number 3. For number 3, let's do 2 radical 3 divided by radical 3 minus 4, and I want to rationalize this. So I'm going to take that denominator and multiply by the sum, radical 3 plus 4. Same in the numerator to keep it equivalent, radical 3 plus 4. I'm going to go ahead and throw parentheses here so I'm not rewriting everything, and we'll go ahead and distribute in that next step. In my numerator, I'm taking 2 radical 3 and distributing it into each of the quantities in the parentheses. Okay, 2 radical 3 times radical 3. I've got a 2 on the outside. Radical 3 times radical 3, and multiply my radicands together for a 9 inside the square root. Okay, now 2 radical 3 times the 4. I multiply those numbers on the outside together. 4 times 2 is 8, and I'm going to put the plus sign in the middle, so plus 8. And then just that radical 3 is multiplied in as well, so radical 3. We'll clean that guy up, the square root of 9, in a second. Okay, now for the denominator. My outer terms, there's a 4 radical 3, and inner terms, a negative 4 radical 3, will cancel out. So I'm not going to do those. Instead, I'm just going to do the first, which are these, and the last, that's my difference of squares, which are those. Can you see? Oh, I'll put the L right there. Okay, radical 3 times radical 3, that's the square root of 9. And then I skip to the end because my outer and inner terms cancel. Negative 4 times positive 4 is negative 16. Do you see those squares, that 9 and the 16? And my difference, the difference of squares. A little bit to clean up here. 2, the square root of 9 is 3, so everything's multiplied. 2 times 3. And then on the other side of the plus sign, there's nothing to simplify. 8 radical 3. In my denominator, the square root of 9 is 3 minus 16. So my answer, you know what, I'm going to write it over here, right there. So my answer then, let's see, that's a 6 plus 8, 6 plus 8 radical 3. I can't combine the 6 and the 8 because the 6 doesn't have a radical with it. In the denominator, 3 minus 16 is negative 13. Put a box around that because that is my answer.